Welcome back to Treehugger Podcast. I am Michael Yadrick, your host. This is the show that talks about all kinds of ecological restoration, where also we explore the intersections with human health and livelihoods, as well as justice in a warming world. Before we begin, I want to thank you, our listeners, for supporting this independent show. Your engagement makes conversations like this possible, and I'm so glad you're here to join us. I'm excited to introduce our guest, Christopher Brown. Christopher is a writer, lawyer, and storyteller whose latest book, A Natural History of Empty Lots, takes us deep into the overlooked and often forgotten corners of urban life. Those spaces where nature quietly reclaims its ground amidst abuse and neglect. In our cities that buzz with quote-unquote construction in progress, there's a quiet revolution happening. One Christopher Brown has spent 2 decades observing. In the shadows of skyscrapers, along abandoned tracks, in stream buffers, nature is rewriting the rules of survival. While many know him for his dystopian novels like Tropic of Kansas and Rule of Capture, Christopher's shift into nonfiction with this book offers a profound meditation on the unexpected vitality of abandoned lots, edgelands, and urban ecosystems. Christopher reflects on how his background as a speculative fiction writer informs his approach to urban nature. In his dystopian novels, he examined the intersections of political power, environmental degradation, and human ingenuity. Those themes carry into his nonfiction, where the landscapes of our cities, both their scars and their beauty, offer lessons about how we might imagine more equitable and meaningful relationships with the environment. As we dive deeper into the ideas that shape Christopher's work, his writing encourages us to notice the negative spaces of our cities. The alleys, brownfields, and riverbanks where life thrives in ways we often ignore. That term, negative space, refers to the areas that are not often in our primary focus but hold significant meaning. Negative space can metaphorically describe areas that are overlooked, neglected, or seen as empty. These spaces, however, still host rich ecological processes, and they challenge traditional notion of what constitutes valuable or productive land, showing how life thrives in the margins. Drawing on years of urban exploration, Christopher shares how these unintentional landscapes have become not only spaces for natural adaptation, but also a mirror reflecting how we interact with the land. Christopher and I explore the political and cultural dimensions of restoration and conservation. Christopher challenges us to rethink traditional ideas about invasive species and restoration as a return to an imagined ecological past. Instead, he advocates for approaching these spaces with humility and curiosity, embracing the complex histories and futures that unfold there. From escaped parakeets creating multifamily nests on cell towers to prairie grasses resprouting in forgotten plains, these moments of spontaneous life reveal a richness that exists outside of human design. We also touch on a deeply personal side of these explorations. Christopher shares stories of rediscovery, a learning from his mother and grandmother's relationships with the land, and of uncovering hidden ecological treasures in the heart of industrial zones. This episode isn't just about the science and politics of nature, it's about rekindling a sense of wonder and love for the wider world around us, even in its most unexpected places. I'm so glad that Christopher chose to join us. Let's settle into this fascinating discussion.
Yeah, I'm Christopher Brown, and I'm the author of the new book, A Natural History of Empty Lots, Field Notes from Urban Edgelands, Back Alleys, and Other Wild Places. And I'm probably best known for dystopian novels like Tropic of Kansas and for a newsletter of urban nature writing I do that's mostly weekly called Field Notes that's available through my website and through the Substack platform. I'm also a lawyer. I'm not a scientist or a professional ecologist. And the new book, A Natural History of Empty Lots, is basically the record of, 20 years or so I've spent living in and documenting and exploring these kinds of wild urban areas.
Excellent. Yeah, congratulations on the book. I think it speaks to or resonates with a lot of urban explorers out there and gets into those nooks and crannies that, most people overlook. I am interested. I haven't read your other books, but your writing really reflects this like a keen eye for the unnoticed beauty in urban environments. So I guess just how did you develop that perspective over a couple decades, I think you just said, and how can others cultivate a similar sense of curiosity about nature in their daily lives?
I think as a writer, counterintuitively, in some ways, I came to it as a writer of fantastic literature, go figure, where you're like making stuff up. But when you're making stuff up, you're really working with, at least for me, and I think most writers in my, branch of those genres, you're working with the material of the observed world. And so you tend to try to look at the things that maybe aren't getting a lot of notice by most people, right? So, like describing the city, but focusing on the kind of negative space of the city and looking around for the things that you're almost trained to unsee because of the way the city wants to train you to focus on its machine purposes of putting you to work and whatnot. And also, it's just part of that kind of basic yearning to look for the wonder in the fabric of everyday life, which is the same kind of thing that drives people, I think, to write fantastic literature or to do nature writing by the same token. They're both modes of narrative that are about amping up the wonder, rediscovering the possibility of awe that can help you break free of the haze of everyday life, I think, in a way that can be really rewarding. And looking for portals, looking for little escape valves from the banalities of everyday life.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, for work and personal life as well, I do creep around urban, forested, natural areas, and sometimes, often I'm there by myself, but sometimes I'll run into somebody and be like, "What are you doing here?" And then, as a former ultra runner as well, is always like long distances and taking shortcuts through things and getting lost. I saw some of myself in some of the
Yeah.
stories you had. So you
I totally,
do,
as a runner, I was going to say, run like trail running in the city is a perfect example of like how you find these kinds of places. If you go at it with that mode, that's how I found a lot of these places. It's just I don't want to drive out of town, but I want to get away from the crowd. Okay, what's down here? And very quickly, if you're running, you can be like, oh wow, how
yeah.
did I get here? And then yeah, to your point, you run into other fellow weirdos. So,
Yeah,
but
seriously. Are there urban spaces that you've encountered or that you're familiar with that have surprised you the most in terms of its biodiversity or ecological significance? If
yeah,
your if your favorite vacant lot could talk, what story do you think it would tell?
my favorite vacant lots, they tell you the story in a way when you walk through there, and especially over successional periods of time. But there's just like all these hidden histories that they contain of what's going on that spot, histories of life coming and going, and the both the ghosts of the past and the kind of imminent ghosts of the future, and just all the kind of weird signs in the land that you learn to read over time, almost some weird urban version of a tracker, right? Like the the Aragorn Strider figure going on. And it is, you learn to see, you find these objects and sort of some of it's just like random bits of human trash that have been totally decontextualized and manifest weird kind of free zones of the uncanny, like when you find some like kid's toy, just like the severed head of a doll, or um, some fragment of a sign that's acquired some other meaning because of the letters that are left or whatever, or the astonishing like plants you'll sometimes see in an otherwise blighted, invasive run field, and suddenly there'll be some like miraculous little native plant that you don't even see that often in that area, or some weird exotic plant. I mean, like I remember walking around in one weird woods and suddenly there's like a pomegranate tree fruiting amid all these like old sycamores and hackberries, and it was just like an exotic that could hold out there. And then you often find in the places I'm traveling, which are often in riparian zones, right? Which I think are particularly interesting. The kind of floodplains of urban rivers, you find artifacts of the deep past. And whether it's the trash of 19th century settlers, like old weird, like pharmaceutical or apothecary glass, or pieces of teacups and porcelain china, or bits of transformer glass, or you'll find Neolithic tools, right? Like stone tools that just the river washes up. We found something. One of my neighbors found something that we took to this identification day at the local Natural History Museum at the university. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's a gouge that's 10,000 to 12,000 years old. It's like, wow, as old as the Pleistocene extinction. Maybe it had some agency in it. Who knows? So I think these places all tell kind of deep stories, but fundamentally, the vacant lots tell the story in the period when they're allowed to be vacant of how good nature can be at fixing itself, or sort of, achieving its own recovery and finding its way to some kind of balance or equilibrium in that particular moment in time and climate that it happens to be in.
Yeah, I was just like flashing back. You're mentioning like kids' toys and yeah, endangered plants or things like that, and definitely like just every day, like my work as urban ecological restoration practitioner. Yeah, I run into just as much as revegetating a place and just all the geeking out about plants. Like also there's like trash removal. Like there's one spot that
Yeah.
is right near here, right near where I live, where it was formerly someone lived there and it was purchased or abandoned because freeways condemn, neighborhoods a lot of times, or cut in
Yeah.
between neighborhoods a lot of times. It's just like we were planting a couple weeks ago and just like chunks of like asphalt and concrete, and then kids squirt guns or
Yeah.
yeah, or there's a place in South Tacoma that was formerly Oak Prairie, and there's this fawn lilies that we really only see in like relatively untouched prairie systems. So yeah, it's so fascinating what you find out there. The restoration crew has found a treasure trove of Barbie dolls that they basically have like things we bring back to the shop that you just always find out there. Um,
Yeah.
so I'm really interested in, yeah, this like the richness of life within these urban spaces that are overlooked and abandoned. I often think places that are even now parks now, like they were never meant to be parks because they're either too steep or too wet, or for whatever reason, they're public space, the city or the state inherited them for whatever reason. They're important green spaces, but in the
Yeah.
literature, honestly, they are described as unintentional landscapes. So perhaps
Yeah.
spaces that have been developed without deliberate planning, or to counter that, have been deliberately planned and sort of marginalized because they are on the edge of, let's say, the freeway or whatever,
Yeah.
and they do contribute to urban biodiversity. So how do you think this sort of tilts conservation practices on its head, and like how we define natural spaces within novel ecosystems is what often we call them.
Yeah. What's most striking to me about these kinds of places is these sorts of unintentional landscapes, to use your term, which is a great term. They they're so much more alive in a way to me than the places that get more like active human attention, at least the kind of parks and rec kind of human attention, because when we intentionally develop parks, we just intend, because of the nature of our systems of governance and kind of the purpose of like parks departments, it's mainly to serve the human community. And we do have work we do to try to have more like wildlife sanctuary kinds of zones and whatnot. But I find that these unmanaged spaces tend to be much more intensely inhabited by wildlife, especially like mammalian wildlife or interesting birds, raptors and whatnot, than are the places that just have a lot more human traffic, because the animals are just. And so if you're like me and I'm like, my whole life trying to find like where are the damn animals I keep seeing in the books. I want to experience some interactions with other life, right? This feels like one of the fundamental things we should have to as part of the richness of our lives. So we're kind of like, oh, and then I slowly started going like, oh, they're like, you want to see some coyotes? They're back in there behind the power plant in that little spot where there's probably a hole in the fence and it's all greened off and it just looks like an impassable bramble full of vegetative life and Lord knows what other kinds of life. So I think that there's a weird way in which, at least in cities, I think probably in like any city, there's a way in which the worst kind of industrial land uses can be the most effective creators of like zones of inadvertent wilderness preservation because they just keep the human activity out. And at least in terms of maybe less true of plants, but animal life, a lot of animal life is really looking for ways to evade the human gaze, especially during the daylight hours. And they just know how to find these zones. And yeah, if you learn to kind of like think like if I were a coyote or a fox, where would I go? That's a good way to find these kinds of places. And lastly, I'll just say those kinds of places, echoing what I was saying earlier, they really like when you find them and they've been allowed to just do whatever the kind of natural ecology, some of which may be a mix of natives and invasives, wants to do. They really do evidence nature's kind of astonishing resilience in a way that's really affirming, especially when you learn often that what looked like a remnant when you first discovered, oh, this must be some intact wetland that's been preserved somehow. No, actually, it was like a gravel pit 40 years ago, and this is what happened when it was left alone. Wow.
Yeah, I do try to avoid the connotation that these places are fragile. Yeah, I feel like that's sort of dangerous because often we see these places as, in my profession or in ecological restoration anyway, these are places that have been degraded, damaged, or destroyed, and they are full of life. And sometimes it's not the sort of charismatic wildlife. I was meeting with folks from the zoo, and they have these wildlife cameras out there that captured like some skunks in this one ravine, and that was like a good sign. That was like a sign of like relatively healthy urban patch of forest. I don't know if you feel if that helps you stay hopeful and optimistic, and I feel like that's what I'm hearing from you, where you see like ecological potential out there in
Yeah,
some
I feel like, yeah, I mean, I try to look at the world with both eyes open, right? I read the biodiversity census that the World Wildlife Fund puts out. They just came out with a new one and the new Living Planet report. And you read about things like the idea that like 73% of the vertebrate wildlife population has disappeared since 1970. And there are lots of people now questioning exactly how accurate are those kinds of censuses and estimates. But there's some kind of range in there that's pretty extreme. Even if it's half that, it's still a horrifying number. And when you go out into these kinds of places, on the one hand, and you look at, yeah, we have a bunch of these old gravel pits along the Colorado River here that the city has acquired because there's on the cheap because no other developers wanted them. And then they just very quickly, before they get taken over by the Parks Department and kind of prettied up, they kind of rewild on their own. And you go into those places, and especially when they've just become abandoned, you see how good we are at erasing all life from our domain, right? And in a way that can be really heavy. But then when you see that sort of recovery, at the same time, it can give you tremendous hope for the potential of wild nature to reassert itself wherever we leave its space, even if it makes you a little cynical about us. So if that maybe that's a fair answer.
No, that's right. Yeah, and this concept
Yeah.
of, you mentioned this word wild, and I've had this, I don't know if it's quite a reckoning, but I feel like this a little bit of tension
because I have always worked in these urban spaces that have been somewhat impacted by clear cutting and development, and often and you point this out, I think, in your book a few times, where we often think about, there's been this spontaneous rewilding of vacant spaces, but often, in some respects, rewilding is often seen as a restoration of wilderness, and which is like connotates a place that's devoid of people, but critiques of wild suggest that this concept can ignore the deep histories of indigenous stewardship, while also obscuring like land dispossession and other effects of colonialism. So I'm wondering if you've thought about that, the practice of rewilding, and how it recognizes and incorporates these like social or these historical contexts and the power relations, like where you're at or what you've experienced, and if you really thought about kind of wilderness and the turning something back to a certain arbitrary point in time, or I think you referred to it as looking forward to some sort of compromised future that we're heading toward.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, absolutely. I think we all have to constantly interrogate the sort of post colonial assumptions and biases and frames of viewing that we bring to bear when we go out into the landscape, right? And I mean, uh, I grew up like, my parents, when I was in college, they acquired a big acreage of kind of blighted timberland in southern Iowa and set out to restore it using controlled burns. And, my mother, who was an immigrant from Germany, she read all this stuff about, and this is like back in the 80s, and she read all this, these things about studies of kind of indigenous uses in the North American landscape of controlled burns. Um, uh, and the results they achieved of restoring like a Midwestern oak savanna using nothing other than fire, not a single seed introduced, was just like astonishing. The biodiversity impact was mind blowing. But at the same time, even that to me, and if my mom listens to this, she can yell at me. But there's a certain like, oh, now I'm managing the land like the people that were once here did, and it's like, no, it's not really like that. I don't feel like I have even standing to kind of to do more than to try to interrogate my own assumptions, and then stepping back from a totally different angle of attack. As a lawyer, I'm really interested in like interrogating all of the sort of legal and economic bases of colonialism and our colonial and extractive relationship with the land. And I talk in the book, and I've kind of addressed in my fiction, some of these things are just some of these real world like legal cases that are that when you read them, they expose right on their face the sort of lies that underlie the entire idea of our dominion over this particular land. I'm thinking of that in this country, at least, definitely all real property, when you dig into it, is grounded in theft of some sort, and so attacking those things and looking at using Western or Anglo American legal tools to talk about things like the personhood of objects in nature and things like that. Those are ways to get to similar endpoints through kind of the tool set we have, and hopefully informed by and guided by an understanding, the way in which people in indigenous communities were able to manage the land, if that kind of word even makes sense, to live in a kind of equilibrium with nature that we are like totally incapable of doing. So just trying to like aspire to get to something like that, and to partner with people who have the cultural backgrounds to more authentically help think about how to do that. I'm totally down for that. And that's kind of part of the aim of this whole book, is like, how do you change how you see nature in a way that helps you decolonize the natural world around you and decolonize yourself along the way, right? and help decolonize your community, and seeing all those things intersectionally. I'm not presuming to say I've got all the answers, but
Nice. Yeah, I appreciate that answer and the depth to it. Yeah, and it's really interesting in producing this podcast and kind of keeping it going. Like I'm able to work out a lot of ideas that I just would otherwise stew on or just maybe never resolve, but
yeah,
just swipe away. And so there was a few episodes a couple years ago. I interviewed Jessica Hernandez, who's a indigenous scholar here in the Pacific Northwest, and she did mention really, yeah, as a way to decolonize ourselves, like as white folks, and is just to inspect like where our ancestors came from and perhaps like how they used plants or how they interacted with the environment, and really just going beyond just the 23 and me. And yeah, really thinking about, and that's what I've thought about recently with like quote unquote invasive species, perhaps, is just like taking responsibility for like knowing the how these plants were used perhaps by my ancestors traditionally, right? Like so like ivy, maybe blackberry, like thinking about like how they're actually used instead of just ripping them out and treating them like trash, because obviously we live in this, as you say, this sort of maybe compromised environment, or at least this very altered environments, and being able to adapt our practices, because yeah, a lot of these, the pomegranate tree or whatever you find is like
yeah,
sometimes it's here to stay. I mean, you can rip it out, but does that really help our relationship with the land? So
yeah,
sorry,
totally.
rambling thoughts, but
No, it's true. It's true. And what you say, I mean, yeah, like, I learned as I got older and got interested in this work, I realized I had all these things I could learn from my own mother and grandmother, who were Germans who came over here after World War II. And then I was like, when I was a kid, I was always like tease them for what nature nerds they were. And then I like realized, oh yeah, they were like refugees for 18 months after the end of World War II, and they had to travel overland through the mountains of Austria and into southern Germany. And that's why my mom knows what all the mushrooms are, because they had family knowledge that had been passed down from mother to daughter for generations of like how to forage when you need to. And it like helped them get through that period. And that's why when she got here, she was like, I'm gonna try to take this like land that these farmers have been screwing up and see if I can help it recover. And yeah, and she definitely did from a mycological perspective. And to your point, I think there's a lot of value in looking at that. And I try to do some of that in the book as well, and to dig into especially the kinds of knowledge about other life on Earth that exists outside of the traditions of agriculture and the domestication of that other life.
yeah, there's a lot to learn from our grandmas.
Yeah.
So I, d- I am interested in. I mean, I see you as a storyteller. I think your day job, you trade your labor for a paycheck as an attorney as well. But I'm really interested in what role you think artists and writers and storytellers can play in this rapidly changing world, and how it can inform urban restoration efforts and public awareness about all different ecological issues, but in particular, sort of ecologies of negative space and empty lots.
I mean, I think, especially for writers, language is ground zero in a way for thinking about changing how we think about nature and changing how we think, period. I joke in the book that taxonomy, or not joke, I comment in the book that taxonomy can be the enemy of wonder, that there's value in trying to figure out how to harness the power of the experience of things unmediated by naming them. You don't need to learn the name of the thing before you go out and witness what it is. And like experiencing, that's what's the beauty of like going out into like kind of spaces that are not designated as natural areas, where there will be no interpretive guidance provided, where you got to read the land yourself. It's just like long-winded way of saying interrogating how we use language, like the very idea of the word nature. embodies in it a separation as a thing apart from us in most of our uses of it. And so writers, I think, and all of us as writers, as language-based communicators, can work on ways to hack that. And I think other modes of narrative and visual communication and even musical and like sound-based communication, like field recordings. There's so many people doing really interesting things in field recordings to mix like natural sounds and anthropogenic sounds to help you see how you like are always tuning out one and tuning in the other. I think all of those modes have a capacity to help people and help ourselves learn to see the world with fresh eyes or hear it, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think embracing that is really important. All right. Are you down for a few rapid fire
Yeah,
questions?
let's do it.
All right. This is one I've started to ask everyone. Is there one word to complete or describe restoration? And the question is, or the fill in the blank is, restoration is.
Utopia, I say, as a speculative fiction writer. It's like the thing you aspire for, but it doesn't really exist and cannot be achieved.
Wow. Okay. That's a good one. This is a new question, so I'm fascinated by the results. It's a little informal survey.
Ah.
Um, Favorite unexpected species you've encountered in an urban setting?
Ringtail cat. It's like an animal I didn't even know existed. It's a procyon. It's like raccoon relative that has both like vulpine and feline characteristics. Super cool.
Wow. All right.
Yeah, it's a
Ringtail cat.
kind of a southwestern border zone creature. It's like a small, kind of like a coati but like a little
Oh,
one.
Kwati Mundi. Nice. All right. Favorite spot. Are you in Austin now? Favorite spot in
Yeah, I'm
Austin to
in
watch.
Austin.
Okay. Favorite spot in Austin to watch nature adapt to the city.
The Colorado River below Longhorn Dam and the floodplain around it, which is mostly wooded.
Nice. Sounds like a good spot.
Hmm.
Top book besides yours that shaped how you think about urban landscapes.
I think that would be The Unofficial Countryside by Richard Mabey, a British writer. It's a book that came out in 1973. He was a really cool guy. His first book was called Food for Free, which was like a hippie foraging book that was a big hit in the 60s. The Unofficial Countryside is like seasonally walking around the urban edges of London and looking at it through a natural history prism or an ecological prism, beautifully written. And he preceded all this. There's all this British literature of edgelands that he's a root of.
Edgelands. Okay, that's a good word.
Yeah.
Start to use
That's
that
another
one.
book. There's a
Start to
book
use that
called
one.
Edgelands, yeah,
I know.
by Michael Simmons, and Paul
Right.
Farley. That's came out in 2011. That's about those kinds of spaces. But yeah,
Nice. Um, if you could teleport to any edgeland for an afternoon,
yeah.
where would you go?
I want to see the Chernobyl exclusion zone. I'm really curious.
Mhm.
That would be cool. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
it's
definitely like
classic.
you'd have to teleport now because you couldn't get there other than it's like
Yeah,
in Ukraine. So
classic. Yeah, classic bucket list. Unintentional
yeah, right.
landscape. Yeah. A species you think deserves a second look, even if it's considered quote unquote invasive.
I love the monk parakeets, which are they come around and they eat like the pods of the mesquite trees, which are like co-evolved to be eaten by animals that died off in the Pleistocene extinction.
Mm.
And they're just charismatic and cool, and they're like a totally exotic invasive species that has filled an ecological niche that had been vacant for 10,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And they turned cell phone towers into multifamily condo stick nests.
Wow.
And I'm down for that.
Nice. I think I had some run-ins with some parakeets in Bolivia when I was a Peace Corps volunteer there, and I totally thought, yeah, when I got there, I like landed, and boots on the ground. I'm like, "Whoa, these are cool parakeets!" Like these flocks of I don't know if they're called
Yeah.
flocks, parakeets flying around. And I was like, "Oh, it's super exotic." But then it comes to people come to tell me that they're from the tropical areas of South
Yeah,
America or
exactly.
something. Yeah,
Yeah.
parakeets are cool.
They're basically
Um,
escaped pets. Yeah.
yeah,
So,
oh yeah, that's right.
yeah.
There is a section in Matthew Gandy's book about street dogs.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. The escape pets sort of thing.
There's a
How
whole
they,
book another book from 1973. I'm not thinking of the author out there in my head, but it's The Ecology of Stray Dogs. It's a really
hmm
cool study of like stray dogs in 1970s Baltimore.
yeah, in Baltimore. Okay, wow. All right. How about this last one? One song or album that captures the feeling of exploring the edgelands.
I'm gonna date myself by talking about a Gordon Lightfoot song, there's this Gordon Lightfoot song called Seven Island Suite, which is about it really has this feel of like at the edge of the city in the maritime Canada kind of context, but it really delves into that. And there's another song on that same album, which is Sundown. And again, this is another thing I think from like 1973, another thing of it, called The Watchman's Gone. It's about basically like walking around a rail yard and the feeling of both like entropy and possibility and the kind of like green edges of a rail yard. And it's just, I don't know, he captures the kind of emotion of those kinds of places in a way that I think is powerful.
Excellent. All right, I'm gonna look up that song. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Congratulations about the book. Is there any info you could drop about where people can find the book?
Yeah, the book is available basically anywhere books are sold, online or bricks and mortar. And, if you want to go to your local independent bookshop, then they should have a copy. And if they don't, they can order you one, or that you can order one and give them credit through Bookshop or wherever you like to buy your books. Or go to my website, christopherbrown.com, and there's links to that and links to my newsletter as well.
Nice. Yeah, I recently subscribed to the newsletter too. It's like a whole bonus section to the book,
Yeah,
I
thank
felt
you.
like. So, yeah, it's excellent. All right. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Really great to meet you.
Likewise, Michael, thank you so much for having me. I love what you do.
Thank you so much for joining us today on this journey through the hidden, overlooked corners of our world with Christopher Brown. Conversations like these remind us that beauty and wonder aren't just found in faraway landscapes or pristine wilderness. They're right here in the cracks and margins of our cities, waiting for us to notice. Christopher's words inspire us to slow down, look closer, and rekindle a love for the world around us, even in the most unexpected places. If this conversation resonated with you, I encourage you to check out the show notes for links to Christopher's incredible book, A Natural History of Empty Lots. It's a work that will change the way you see your neighborhood and challenge you to think differently about nature and our place in it. You'll also find details about his book and upcoming events. If you get the chance to hear him speak in person, don't miss it. To our listeners, your support means everything to me. Whether you've been with us for a long time or this is your first episode, thank you for tuning in and being part of the Treehugger podcast community. Your curiosity and love for the planet fuels the stories we bring to life here. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, or reach out and let us know what you think. I love hearing from you. As I sign off today, I'll leave you with this thought. In a world that often feels rushed and fragmented, it's worth taking a moment to pause, to look around, and to fall back in love with the small, extraordinary details of life. Let's keep finding those connections and imagining better futures together. Until next time, take care, keep growing, hug a tree, or at least take a walk through the overlooked spaces you might pass by every day. Thanks for listening. See you in the woods.